Canada has just enacted Bill C-202, a groundbreaking 2025 law safeguarding its dairy and supply management sectors from U.S. pressure. This means key American goods, from milk to auto parts, face new restrictions at the border. And the blow won't be evenly spread. 10 U.S. states, heavily reliant on Canadian trade, could collapse economically first. Who are the states on the front lines? What's driving this retaliatory move? And how might your local job market or price tag get wrecked by this law? Buckle up. This fallout is just starting. 1. Michigan auto collapse ground zero. Michigan is about to get hit hardest. As home to America's big three automakers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, Michigan sends over $20 billion worth of vehicles and auto parts across the border every year. Canada's new Bill C-202 includes stricter country of origin checks and higher tariffs on U.S.-made parts, especially electronics, steel frames, and electric vehicle batteries. Why? Ottawa claims the U.S. has flooded its market with subsidized EV components, breaking existing trade agreements. Now, any American-made vehicle with over 40% non-Canadian content could face border rejection or penalty tariffs. For Detroit's economy, this is catastrophic. Suppliers across the state, from chip makers in Ann Arbor to gearbox factories in Grand Rapids, rely on seamless cross-border shipping. Any disruption slows production, cancels orders, and kills jobs. Auto unions are already preparing for layoffs if demand from Canadian plants collapses. The real danger? It's not just exports, it's integration. Michigan and Ontario's auto industries function as one ecosystem. If Canada begins sourcing more from Europe or Asia instead of Detroit, Michigan could face a long-term economic identity crisis. In 2025, this isn't a trade dispute, it's an industrial divorce. And Michigan may lose the house, the car, and the future. 1. Vermont. For Vermont, Canada's new law is like a punch to the gut. The state's economy is tightly woven with dairy, cheese, milk, yogurt, and nearly 15% of all dairy products made in Vermont end up in Canadian markets, mostly in Quebec and Ontario. But with Bill C-202, Canada is reinforcing its supply management system, which limits how much foreign dairy enters the country to protect its own farmers. The law imposes steep import quotas and sets minimum price floors that make U.S. dairy nearly impossible to compete. Vermont's small family farms, already battling inflation, consolidation, and workforce shortages, are now at serious risk. Many were counting on Canadian exports to stay afloat. Without access, they'll be forced to sell below cost, shut down, or fire staff. Local creameries and cheese producers will feel the pain next. It's not just rural farms either. Trucking, packaging, and tourism sectors tied to Vermont's dairy economy will take collateral damage. Expect milk prices to rise regionally and cross-border co-ops to collapse. Local leaders have already called the trade fallout devastating, and federal aid could take months or years to arrive. Canada's move might protect their own farms, but it could leave Vermont's dairy industry gutted. In 2025, this is more than a trade law. It's an agricultural emergency. 1. Washington. Washington state's timber industry is on red alert. Canada's new law, Bill C-202, includes retaliatory duties on softwood lumber imports from the U.S., directly targeting Pacific Northwest exports. For Washington, where lumber is one of the top 5 export sectors to Canada, this move could be devastating. Why the retaliation? Canada argues the U.S. has unfairly subsidized its lumber industry, distorting North American markets. In response, it has reinstated a countervailing duty of up to 24% on American timber crossing the border. And Washington gets hit hardest due to proximity and volume. Sawmills from Spokane to Aberdeen are already facing reduced orders. Logging companies are slashing output. And construction material suppliers are warning of massive overstock and price crashes. Nearly 11,000 jobs in Washington are tied directly to lumber exports to Canada. The ripple effect will hit rail and freight companies next, followed by small-town economies that depend on forestry work. Combined with U.S. housing demand softening in 2025, Washington's timber towns could face a dual-market collapse. Canada, meanwhile, is accelerating internal procurement and shifting imports to the EU. That means even if the policy reverses later, Washington may already be locked out of the market. This isn't just a trade scuffle, it's a structural breakdown of a century-old trade route, and Washington's economy may splinter with it. 1. North Dakota. North Dakota has long relied on Canada as a key customer for its wheat, barley, and soybean exports, with shipments crossing north by rail and truck into Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But with Bill C-202, Canada is now invoking food security protections, slashing U.S. grain imports in favor of domestic production and tighter phytosanitary inspections. That means crops once destined for Canadian mills and processors are now sitting in silos unsold. And for farmers, time is money. Prices are dropping locally while costs for fertilizer, diesel, and storage keep rising. Some cooperatives in North Dakota have already reported canceled contracts and hundreds of thousands in immediate losses. This law also increases delays at agricultural checkpoints, adding red tape that could ruin perishable loads. Even grains that do make it into Canada may face extra labeling or contamination testing, slowing trade to a crawl and discouraging future deals. North Dakota's agricultural economy is tightly integrated with cross-border logistics, so rail carriers, port operators, and customs brokers are feeling the pinch. One railroad CEO called it the worst disruption to cross-border ag in 30 years. Without federal subsidies or emergency relief, North Dakota farmers may face a painful 2025 harvest cycle, marked by oversupply, low prices, and no buyer in sight. And the worst part, Canada's pivot to self-sufficiency could permanently reroute demand away from American farms. 1. New York. When most people think of New York, they think of Wall Street or Broadway, not trade trucks. But in reality, New York is the third largest U.S. state for exports to Canada, largely due to its shared border with Ontario and Quebec. Thousands of small and mid-sized businesses rely on daily cross-border shipments, everything from electronics and machinery to processed foods and chemicals. Bill C-202 is now disrupting all of it. Tighter customs inspections, new labeling rules, and origin tracing have caused delays of up to 72 hours at major crossings like the Peace Bridge and Thousand Islands. For perishable goods and just-in-time manufacturing, these delays are brutal. Businesses in Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse are reporting rising freight costs and missed Canadian orders. New York-based manufacturers say they're losing contracts to EU and Asian competitors who aren't caught in the political crossfire. Tourism is suffering too. Canada's policy change includes increased entry taxes and tolls for U.S. commercial vehicles, raising costs for tour operators and transport companies. Fewer Canadians are crossing the border for shopping and entertainment, draining millions from upstate economies. The Chamber of Commerce warns that New York could lose over $2 billion in trade revenue this year alone if tensions continue. For a state built on cross-border exchange, New York is suddenly walled in and bleeding money. 1. Minnesota may be known for its lakes and winters, but its economy is deeply dependent on advanced manufacturing, much of which flows directly into Canada. The state exports more than $6 billion annually to its northern neighbor, ranging from medical devices and agricultural machinery to iron ore and precision electronics. Canada's 2025 law, Bill C-202, has targeted two things Minnesota does best: specialized steel products and industrial components. The new regulation requires these imports to meet stricter environmental sourcing standards, and some Minnesota companies have already failed Canada's new compliance checks. For firms in Duluth, St. Cloud, and Minneapolis, this means canceled purchase orders, halted production lines, and layoffs in precision machining and steel fabrication. Some suppliers report a 40% drop in Canadian demand within just the first quarter of 2025. Compounding the issue is Canada's new Buy Canadian First procurement pledge, which directs public infrastructure projects to use domestic or non-U.S. parts where possible. This move alone could shut out Minnesota-based companies that had long supplied equipment for Canadian hospitals, rail projects, and agriculture initiatives. Economists warn that this could trigger a cascade of job losses in Minnesota's rural counties, where many of these manufacturers are the largest employers. If nothing changes, 2025 could mark the moment Minnesota's manufacturing backbone cracks under foreign policy pressure. 1. Illinois may be landlocked, but it's a freight and machinery powerhouse, and a key player in U.S.-Canada trade. The state exports billions in heavy machinery, engines, construction equipment, and rail components, largely manufactured in hubs like Peoria, Joliet, and Rockford. With Canada's Bill C-202 in effect, much of that flow has slammed into regulatory walls. The law now requires advanced emissions certifications, country of origin audits, and parts traceability, slowing cross-border movement and complicating deals. Canadian firms that once relied on Illinois machinery are now looking to domestic or European suppliers. The ripple effects are sharp. Caterpillar, one of Illinois' largest employers, has seen Canadian orders drop significantly. Smaller machine shops that make parts for trucks, cranes, and power systems are being squeezed by lost contracts and higher shipping costs. On top of that, Illinois' massive freight and logistics sector, centered in Chicago, is feeling the crunch. Rail companies, third-party logistics providers, and intermodal hubs are reporting a slowdown in Canada-bound cargo. Some truckers are being rerouted hundreds of miles to bypass stricter border crossings, adding fuel and time costs. The Illinois Chamber of Commerce has warned that up to 30,000 manufacturing and transport jobs could be at risk by year's end if trade doesn't normalize. For the state known as the Crossroads of America, this trade war is turning into a massive traffic jam and an economic dead end. 1. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's industrial roots run deep, and Canada has long been one of its biggest customers. In 2025, the state exports billions in steel products, coal, plastics, and chemicals across the northern border. But with Bill C-202 now law, that flow is starting to shut down. The bill introduces new environmental compliance rules and tariffs, specifically targeting fossil-based materials and heavy metals. Pennsylvania's coal exports, which fuel some Canadian power and industrial plants, are now restricted under Canada's new clean energy priority. Demand has collapsed almost overnight. Steel shipments from Pittsburgh and Allentown are also being hit with steep import fees, as Canada's government seeks to protect its domestic producers in Ontario. U.S. steel that doesn't meet Canada's stricter carbon footprint metrics is being denied at the border or rerouted entirely. Meanwhile, the state's large plastics and synthetic chemical producers, centered around Philadelphia and Erie, are facing increased inspections and labeling requirements that have delayed shipments for weeks. The result? Major contract cancellations, job cuts in steel and coal towns, and mounting pressure on freight companies serving the region. Trade officials warn of a $1.2 billion annual loss in Pennsylvania-Canada commerce if nothing changes. For a state already dealing with post-pandemic manufacturing shifts, Bill C-202 feels like another hammer blow to its industrial economy. 1. Ohio is one of the biggest suppliers of auto parts, plastics, rubber, and industrial polymers to Canadian car manufacturers, particularly in Ontario, which houses plants for GM, Honda, and Ford. But Canada's new law, Bill C-202, has redrawn the rules of engagement, and Ohio's manufacturers are already feeling the sting. The law mandates that a higher percentage of auto components used in Canadian-assembled vehicles must be either made in Canada or sourced from countries with newer bilateral trade agreements. The U.S. didn't make the cut, and that spells disaster for Ohio's part makers. In 2024, Ohio exported more than $5.3 billion in vehicle components to Canada. That volume is now being slashed. Firms in Toledo, Dayton, and Akron report large Canadian contracts canceled or renegotiated under harsher terms. Some small and mid-sized suppliers have already laid off workers. The plastics sector is also taking damage. Canada has included new environmental packaging standards in its legislation, forcing U.S. exporters to meet stricter guidelines that many Ohio producers can't adapt to quickly. Shipments are stuck at the border, or outright rejected. Industry groups estimate Ohio could lose over 20,000 jobs in auto-related sectors if these restrictions persist through 2025. For a state that helped build America's car culture, this trade fallout may bring the engine to a halt. 1. California. California may be famous for Hollywood and Silicon Valley, but its economic power goes far beyond entertainment and tech. In 2025, it exports over $17 billion in goods to Canada, including software services, tech hardware, almonds, wine, and fresh produce. Now, with Canada's Bill C-202 in force, California's trade pipeline is buckling. On the tech side, the new law implements stricter cybersecurity compliance and digital sovereignty standards, forcing U.S. cloud services, data centers, and hardware vendors to comply with Canadian data localization rules. For California's software giants, that means millions in new legal and operational costs, or risk losing access to Canada's market altogether. Meanwhile, California's massive agri-export sector is also suffering. Canadian regulators are now enforcing pesticide residue limits and GMO restrictions that exceed U.S. standards. Almonds from the Central Valley, citrus from the Imperial Valley, and wine from Napa are now being turned away at the border or redirected to costlier inspection facilities. Some farm co-ops report a 35% drop in Canadian sales just since Q1 2025. At the Port of Oakland, Canadian-bound shipments have fallen sharply, triggering layoffs among AG exporters and logistics crews. In the long term, if Canada secures new agricultural trade deals with Europe or Latin America, California could be permanently shut out of key consumer markets. For a state that leads America in innovation and agriculture, this fallout is a serious threat to its global dominance. This isn't just agriculture politics, it's a ticking time bomb for parts of the U.S. heartland. If dairy, auto, or lumber jobs disappear, entire communities could unravel. Which state do you live in, and are you feeling the pressure already? Drop a comment and let's talk. If this surprised you, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because this story is far from over.